Her uncle slid the paper across the table before she could finish her first cup of coffee. A marriage contract. Her name printed next to a stranger's. A man the entire town crossed the street to avoid. She looked up at Gerald Carter, the only family she had left in this world, and he looked back at her with the eyes of a man who had already made his decision and was only now informing her of it. "You leave Friday," he said. She was 18 years old. She had never been kissed. She had never even spoken to Mason Blackwood. And she had 4 days left of the only life she knew. If this story reaches your heart, subscribe right now, drop your city in the comments below, and stay with me until the very last word. I want to know how far this story travels. The paper made a dry, flat sound when it hit the kitchen table. Lillian Carter looked at it before she looked at her uncle, because some part of her already knew that whatever was written on it was going to change everything, and she needed one more second of not knowing, one more second where her life was still hers. Then she picked it up. The handwriting at the top was not her uncle's. It was formal and controlled, the kind of penmanship that belonged to a man who chose his words, like he chose everything else, with deliberate economy. And no room for sentiment. 2 names, side by side. Mason Elias Blackwood, Lillian Ann Carter. She read the first line, then the second. Then she set the paper down and pressed both palms flat on the table and stared at the wood grain between her hands and breathed. "This is a marriage contract," she said. "Yes," said Gerald Carter. Her uncle sat across from her, with his arms folded and his shoulders braced the way a man braces himself when he knows an impact is coming. He was 51 years old. He had deep lines across his forehead that had gotten deeper every year since the harvest started failing. He was not a cruel man. Lillian had spent 5 years in his house, and she knew the difference between cruelty and desperation. And right now she was looking at desperation, wearing a calm face. "I don't know this man," she said. "You will, Uncle Gerald." She lifted her eyes to his. "I'm 18. I know how old you are. Then you understand what you're asking me." He held her gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked toward the window, and when he looked away from her like that, Lillian felt something cold move through her chest. Because Gerald Carter had always been a man who could look you in the eye when he spoke, even when what he was saying was hard. The fact that he couldn't do it now told her everything about how much this was costing him, and somehow that made it worse, not better. "The bank called the loan," he said to the window. 3 months. "They gave us 3 months, and then they take everything. The house, the land, the store." He paused. "Your aunt has nowhere else to go." Lillian said nothing. "I've been trying to find another way for 8 months, Gerald said. He turned back to her then, and she saw it fully: the exhaustion, the shame, the particular devastation of a man who had failed at the one thing he believed was his responsibility. "There isn't one. Holloway came to me with this arrangement." "And I Holloway," she said. "The banker." "Yes. The banker brought you a marriage arrangement. Mason Blackwood needs someone to manage his household. He's out there alone on 400 acres, and the operation is sound. The man is solvent." Gerald stopped. "Tried again. He needs a wife." And his voice broke on the last word. Just slightly. Just enough for her to hear it. "I need to save this family." Lillian looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the contract. She looked at her uncle's broken face and at her aunt, Margaret's back near the stove. Her shoulders rigid, stirring a pot that didn't need stirring because standing still was too much to ask of her right now. "Everyone in town says he's dangerous," Lillian said. Gerald's jaw tightened. "People said your father was reckless." It landed like a slap, dressed as a compliment. Lillian felt it move through her, and she kept her face still. "My father is dead," she said. "Your father was the best man I ever knew, and people called him reckless because they couldn't understand a man who lived the way he wanted to." Gerald leaned forward. "Rumors are rumors. That's all they are. A man put through a saloon window is not a rumor. The man had stolen 2 of his horses. The sheriff closed the case same day." Lillian stared at him. "I'm supposed to find that reassuring. You're supposed to understand there's context." She pushed back from the table. She stood up and walked to the window and stood where her uncle had been standing and looked out at the same pale October sky. From here, she could see the edge of the road that led north, up into the mountains. She had never been past the second ridge. She didn't know what was up there, except what people said. And what people said was that Mason Blackwood's ranch sat in a valley so isolated that in a bad winter you could be cut off from town for weeks. She would be cut off from everything. From the library, where she spent Tuesday afternoons. From Mrs. Aldridge, who had been quietly tutoring her with the intention of helping her pass the territorial teaching exam in the spring. From the mercantile, where she knew every person by name. From the grave on the south side of the church, where her parents were buried side by side. "If I say no," she said, still facing the window, "what happens to you? We lose the house before Christmas." And to me, her uncle was quiet for a moment. "You're young and capable. You'd find your footing." The cruelty of it was that he genuinely believed those words were a comfort. She could hear it in his voice. He had constructed a story in his head where Lillian's youth was an asset, where being 18 and alone and without resources was practically an advantage. And he had convinced himself of it thoroughly enough that he could say it to her face without flinching. "When does he need an answer?" she asked. "Thursday." She turned around. "Then I have until Thursday." She took the contract off the table. She walked to her room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed with the document in her lap and read every single word of it. Twice. She read the legal language about property rights and domestic responsibilities. She read the clause about Gerald's debt being settled in full upon completion of the marriage. She read the line about her age being verified by county record. She read all of it with the slow, careful attention of someone who understood that the details of a document are where you find out what kind of person drew it up. And then she found it. At the bottom below the formal printed text, written in different ink, darker, slightly uneven, like a man who was more accustomed to writing with a pencil than a pen. "No person in this arrangement will be compelled against their reasonable nature. Signed M. Blackwood." She read it 5 times. Then she set the contract on her pillow and lay down on her back and stared at the ceiling and thought about a man she had never met who had signed a marriage document to a stranger and felt strongly enough about one thing too. Add a handwritten line at the bottom guaranteeing it. "No person will be compelled against their reasonable nature." Not "she will be treated well." Not "I am a decent man." Not any of the reassurances that a man trying to sell himself might offer. Just that one specific promise. Quiet and plain. The kind of promise a person makes when they have thought about what it would feel like to be on the other side of the arrangement. Lillian lay there as the afternoon turned to evening and the light through her single window went from pale gold to gray to nothing. And she made lists in her head. What she knew, what she didn't, what she was afraid of, what she was willing to endure. She thought about her mother, who had died at 33 and spent the last year of her life saying wished she'd been braver when she was young. She thought about her father on that roof in the ice, and whether there was a version of that story where someone had reached him in time. She thought about the handwritten line. At midnight she was still awake. At 2 in the morning she made her decision. She signed the contract on Wednesday before her uncle came downstairs. She left it on the kitchen table with her pen resting across it and went to start the morning fire. And when Gerald came down and saw it, he stood in the doorway for a long moment without saying anything. "Thank you," he finally said. "Don't," she answered. Not unkindly. "Please just don't." He nodded, he poured his coffee and sat down, and they were quiet together in the way that people are quiet when they have crossed a line they can't uncross. And the only thing left to do is breathe through it. She packed 2 bags on Thursday. Her aunt helped her fold clothes with the rigid efficiency of a woman holding herself together by main force. Margaret Carter folded each item precisely, smoothed every edge, and said nothing of substance for 40 minutes. Then, when the second bag was nearly full, she pressed a small packet into Lillian's hands. Folded cloth. Something hard inside. "What is this?" Lillian asked. "Your mother's," Margaret said. Her voice was stiff and careful. "She left them with me when she got sick. She said to give them to you when you had a home of your own." Lillian unwrapped the cloth. 2 silver thimbles, small and ordinary and worn smooth from use. She held them in her palm and felt the weight of them so light. Almost nothing, and yet heavier than anything else she had packed. "She would have told you to fight like hell," Margaret said. Lillian looked up. Her aunt's eyes were finally wet. Not crying Margaret Carter had never cried in front of anyone in her life, but wet, standing at the edge. "I know," Lillian said. She wrapped the thimbles back in the cloth and put them carefully in the center of her bag where nothing could shift against them. On Friday morning, Horace's wagon was waiting at 6:30. Gerald shook her hand at the door. His grip was firm and held for 2 seconds longer than necessary. She understood what those 2 extra seconds were trying to say. She chose not to receive them as an apology, because she wasn't ready to forgive anything yet. But she held his hand for those 2 seconds, and then she let go and walked to the wagon and climbed up without looking back. She had brought a book. She opened it at the end of the first mile and stared at the words without reading them. Horace drove in silence. He was a man who understood that some situations did not benefit from conversation, and this was one of them. When they had been on the road for an hour and the altitude had started to change the quality of the air, he said, without preamble, "He pays what he owes. Doesn't cause trouble for people who don't cause trouble for him." Lillian lowered her book. "That's the best you can offer? I've known the man 8 years. And that's all you have?" Horace chewed the inside of his cheek for a moment. He found a dog once, half frozen, side of the road in February. He brought it home, fed it all winter, let it sleep inside. He paused. Dog lived another 6 years. I know because he mentioned it when it died, and he wasn't a man who mentioned much. Lillian looked at him. "A dog," she said. "A dog," Horace agreed. She turned back to her book, but her finger found the corner of the same page and held it there without turning. And she sat with that small story in her chest for the rest of the ride, turning it over the way you turn something over when you're not sure yet what it means. The wagon turned down the access track at 9:30. Lillian closed the book. She had told herself 3 things on the ride. First, she would not show fear. Second, she would do exactly what she said she would do, and nothing more and nothing less. Third, she would keep her eyes open and make no judgments before she had evidence. She held all 3 of those things like a woman holds a railing in uncertain weather. The ranch came through the trees, larger than she expected, orderly, a long covered porch, outbuildings well maintained, a garden that had been properly put to rest for winter, which told her that whoever tended it paid attention to timelines. The wagon stopped, and Mason Blackwood came through the door. Lillian had prepared herself for many versions of this man. The version that matched the stories. The version with cold eyes and a mouth set in cruelty. The version that looked at her like something he had purchased. Because in a strictly legal sense, something like that was exactly what had happened. She had not prepared for this. He was large, broader, and taller than the men she knew in town. But what struck her first was not his size. It was the hat. He took it off the moment he stepped off the porch. She had not expected that. A man who removes his hat for a woman he paid for does not think of her as something he paid for. He walked to the wagon without hurrying. He looked at Horace first, which told her he understood social geography. "Any trouble on the road?" "None," said Horace, already climbing down. Then Mason Blackwood turned to her. She had already climbed down herself, which she could tell mildly surprised him. He had been moving toward the wagon with the clear intention of offering a hand. She hadn't waited. Good, she thought. Let him understand from the first 30 seconds that she was not a woman who waited. They looked at each other. He was 32, but he looked like a man who had been 32 for a long time. There were lines around his eyes, and the jaw under his dark beard was sharp and set and gave nothing away. His eyes were dark gray, serious, the kind of eyes that had looked at a great many things with the same neutral steadiness and had learned to keep what they felt about those things entirely private. He said, "Mrs. Blackwood." The name hit her in a place she hadn't expected. She kept her face even. "Lillian," she said. "Please." Something shifted in his expression. Not much, barely. A small adjustment, like a door opening 1 inch. "Mason," he said. Then he turned toward the cabin and said, "Come in out of the cold," and walked ahead of her up the steps, and she followed. And as she came level with him in the doorway, she noticed what was in his left hand. A box, small wooden, sanded smooth, a flower carved on the lid. He set it on the table inside, and then before Horace had finished bringing her bags, before she had time to get her bearings, Before anything, he picked the box back up and held it out to her. No preamble. No explanation first. Just the box extended toward her in a large, calloused hand. She took it. She lifted the lid. Inside, on a fold of soft cloth, lay a hairpin silver. Simple and clean and shaped with care, not the kind of care that wanted to be noticed, but the kind that couldn't help itself. Every curve was deliberate. Every edge finished. The work of someone who knew what they were doing and took the time to do it right. She looked up at him. Mason Blackwood was looking at the wall behind her, left shoulder the way a man looks at a wall when looking at someone's face is too direct a thing to manage. "My mother made things like this," he said. His voice was the same low. Even register it had been outside, but something in it had changed. Gotten quieter. More careful. She had a small forge she kept in the shed. She used to say. He stopped, cleared his throat. Started again. She said every woman deserved something beautiful, even during hard times. Lillian stood in the doorway of a cabin that was now technically her home and held a handmade silver hairpin in a carved wooden box and looked at the face of the man everyone in her town had warned her about, and felt against every preparation she had made, against every careful wall she had built on that wagon ride, something crack. Not break. Not fall. Just crack. The way ice cracks in early spring, when the temperature shifts and everything underneath begins, quietly, to move. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Once, short and definite. Then he said he would show her where things were kept, and he began moving through the cabin, pointing out practical matters, the pantry, the water pump, the loose board in the hallway, in the same quiet voice, with the same deliberate distance, as if the last 2 minutes hadn't happened, as if he hadn't just handed her a piece of his dead mother's legacy before she had even taken off her coat. She followed him. She held the wooden box against her chest with one arm, and she listened to every single word. The first week passed the way. Hard things pass slowly in the days and quickly in memory, so that when she looked back later, she would struggle to account for the individual hours. She woke before sunrise because the cold made sleeping past it impossible. She learned the stove's particular temper, the way it needed coaxing in the mornings and tended in the evenings. She learned that the water pump froze if you didn't run it for 30 seconds before you needed it. She learned that the pantry had an order to it, that Mason had established over years, and that disrupting the order made him quiet in a way that was different from his regular quiet tighter. Slightly pained, so she restored everything to its original position and adapted her own habits around the system he'd already built. She did not see this as defeat. She saw it as information. On the 4th morning, she found him in the kitchen when she came down at 5, which was earlier than he'd been there any of the previous days. He had already made coffee. There were 2 cups on the table. He hadn't looked up when she came in. She sat down across from him and wrapped her hands around the cup and said nothing. They drank their coffee in silence for 10 minutes. Then Mason said, without looking up, "The north fence needs work before the snow." "I know," she said. "I saw it when I walked the yard yesterday." He did look up then. Briefly. "You walked the whole yard?" "I wanted to know the property." A pause. "It's 400 acres. I walked what I could see from the house," she said. "I'm not foolish." Something that wasn't quite a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. Not enough to call a smile, but enough. "The fence," he said again. "It'll take 3 days. I'll help with the posts," she said. This time the pause was longer. He looked at her with that neutral gray gaze, and she looked back and didn't look away. Because she had decided on the wagon ride that she would not be the first one to look away, ever, from anything. "You know how to set a fence post?" he asked. "No," she said. "But I assume you do, and I can follow instructions." Another movement at the corner of his mouth. "There and gone." "All right," he said. They worked on the fence for 2.5 days. It was brutal work. The ground was already hardening toward winter, and every post required twice the effort it would have taken in September. Her hands blistered by the end of the first afternoon. She said nothing about it. She wrapped them that evening with cloth she found in the supply closet and was back at the fence line before Mason the next morning. And when he arrived and saw her already there, with her wrapped hands holding a post anchor, he looked at her for a moment with an expression she was beginning to recognize. It was the expression of a man encountering something that surprised him. He said nothing. He handed her the mallet. She took it. On the 5th day, she found the wooden chest. She was not snooping. She had gone into the barn to look for a spare lantern because the one in the kitchen was running low on oil, and the chest was sitting on a low shelf near the back, not hidden. Exactly, but not displayed either, just there. Old wood, dark with age, with a simple iron latch. She should have left it alone. She didn't. She opened it. Inside, a woman's work gloves, worn thin at the fingertips. A folded piece of cloth that held the smell of lavender even after years. 3 letters tied with string. 2 small drawings, a cabin sketch, and a mountain landscape done in pencil by someone with a careful hand. A child's photograph. And at the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, a small leather journal. She did not open the journal. She did not read the letters. But she held the gloves for a moment and looked at the worn fingertips. And she thought about a woman who had a small forge in a shed and believed every woman deserved something beautiful during hard times. And she understood, without needing to read a single word, that she was holding what was left of Mason Blackwood's mother. She put everything back exactly as she found it. She latched the chest. She went back to the house without the lantern she had come for and trimmed the wick of the kitchen lamp instead to make the oil last longer. And she sat at the table in the spare light and looked at the silver hairpin she had left there that morning and thought about the distance between a man who kept grief in a chest in a barn and a man who handed that grief's most beautiful product to a stranger on her first day. She thought, he could have kept it, he chose not to. She thought, that is not an accident. She thought, that is a man who wanted, in the only way he knew how, to make a specific kind of promise. 3 weeks in, the women from town arrived. She heard the wagon before she saw it. She was splitting kindling in the side yard, which she had gotten competent at. Through sheer repetition, the hatchet came down straight now. She didn't have to reset her grip between strikes. Her aim was consistent. She had spent her entire life in a town, doing things considered appropriate for women, and she had arrived at this ranch to discover that her range of what she was capable of was substantially larger than anyone had ever allowed her to find out. She put the hatchet down when she heard the wagon and looked up. Clara Hutchins climbed down first. Lillian knew her from the Mercantile Gerald, had done business with her husband for years. Clara was 43 and had the particular posture of a woman who had spent decades being the authority on other people's situations. Behind her came a woman Lillian didn't recognize, and a third woman who stayed in the wagon bed and watched. Lillian, Clara said, coming toward her with a smile that was all surface. We wanted to see how you were managing. I'm managing, Lillian said, out here. Clara looked around the yard, the mountains, the long empty track back to town. By yourself. With him I'm not by myself. That's almost worse, isn't it? Said the woman Lillian didn't know. Clara didn't contradict her. The whole town knows it was arranged, Clara said, lowering her voice. Lillian, no one would blame you if you were struggling. If I wanted to what? Lillian asked. Clara hesitated. Come home, there are people who would help. Lillian looked at her steadily. Come home to what, exactly? My uncle's house is mortgaged to the point of collapse. My teaching position that didn't exist yet certainly still doesn't exist. And what would I tell people that I left a man I've known for 3 weeks because of stories I heard from people who have never spoken to him? He put a man through a window. The man stole his horses. The sheriff agreed. Lillian picked up the hatchet. I know what people say about Mason Blackwood. I also know that he spent 3 nights last winter treating every animal on this property for lung fever and didn't lose one. I know he helped the Harlan family repair their fence last spring and didn't ask for anything. I know he added a line to our marriage contract by hand guaranteeing that I would not be compelled against my reasonable nature. Her voice had stayed even the whole time. She was proud of that. Those are not the actions of the man people describe. The 3 women were quiet. Clara's expression had moved through surprise and into something more complicated. She looked at the hatchet. She looked at Lillian's wrapped hands, the blisters visible at the edges of the cloth. You're very sure, Clara said. I'm observant, Lillian said. It's different. Clara opened her mouth and closed it, turned to the woman behind her, and then turned back. Well, she said, if you ever need anything. I appreciate the visit, Lillian said. Truly. safe road back. She watched them go. She stood in the yard with the hatchet at her side until the wagon had moved far enough down the track that the sound of it was gone, and then she stood a moment longer in the silence of the mountains, which was a different quality of silence than any she had known before, bigger, denser, more complete. Then she went back to the kindling. She had been splitting for another 20 minutes when she heard the barn latch. She didn't turn around. She kept her rhythm steady. Pick up the piece. Set it. Bring the hatchet down. Move to the next one. Mason came and stood at the edge of the yard and said nothing. She split 4 more pieces. Then he said, "You didn't have to do that, I know," she said. "You believe any of it? What you said to them?" She set the hatchet down and turned to face him. He was standing with his arms at his sides, in the attitude of a man who was trying very hard to hold still. "I said what I know," she told him. "I didn't say anything I don't know." He looked at her for a long moment. "The Harlan fence," he said. "Who told you about that?" "Horace." "Of course." He looked away toward the mountains, the same direction she always found herself looking when she needed a moment to think. "People in town," he said. "They're not entirely wrong about me." "I didn't say they were entirely wrong," she answered. "I said they didn't have the whole picture." He looked back at her. She held his gaze. "The coffee's hot," she said. "I made extra this morning." He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I'll be in after I check the east pasture." "I'll keep it warm," she said. He nodded, turned, walked, and Lillian Carter picked up her hatchet and went back to her work with her wrapped hands and her sore shoulders and the particular satisfaction of a woman who has said exactly what she meant and has not apologized for a single syllable of it. That evening, when she sat down to dinner, there was something at her place on the table. A wildflower. Late season, half its color gone, stem too short, sitting in a tin cup of water that someone had placed there with great care to make sure it sat straight. She looked at it. She looked across the table at Mason, who was already focused on his plate, with the concentrated attention of a man studying something extremely interesting about his beans. She sat down. She put her napkin in her lap. She said, "The north fence is holding well." "It'll hold through the winter," he said. "The post on the east end is still soft. I'll reset it tomorrow. I'll come." He looked up. She was already reaching for the bread. They ate their dinner in the quiet of the cabin, with the fire behind them and the wind, finding the eaves and the wildflower standing in its cup to them. The tilted just slightly to the left, catching the firelight. And Lillian Carter thought, "I have been wrong about almost everything." And then she thought, "I am not wrong about this." And she kept eating. And the fire held, and the wind worked along the roof, looking for. The wildflower was gone by morning. Mason had cleared the table before she came downstairs, the way he always did when he rose before her, which was every day. Without exception, no matter how early, she set her intentions the night before. The tin cup was washed and back on its hook. The table was bare. If she hadn't seen it with her own eyes the night before, she might have convinced herself she'd imagined it. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the empty table and decided that this was the most Mason Blackwood thing that had ever happened. Give something quietly. Remove the evidence before it could become a conversation. Retreat back into the ordinary before anyone could assign it meaning. She put the coffee on and said nothing about it. Neither did he. When he came in from the morning chores at 6:30, with cold air still on his coat and his hat in his hand, they drank their coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up overnight. November was arriving the way it always arrived, in the high country, not gradually, not with warning, but all at once like a door kicked open. "Storm by the end of the week," Mason said, looking at the window. "How bad?" "Bad enough." He wrapped both hands around his cup. "I need to move the cattle to the south pasture before it hits. Check the roof on the barn. Get the smokehouse stocked. Tell me what you need me to do," she said. He looked at her across the table with the particular look she had come to recognize as his version of surprise, not wide-eyed, not dramatic, just a slight stillness, a fractional pause in whatever he'd been about to say next. "The pantry," he said after a moment. "Go through what we have. Make a list of what we're short on. If the storm's as bad as I think, we won't be getting to town for 3 weeks. 3 weeks, she repeated. Minimum. She thought about that. 3 weeks with no road. No contact. No way in or out. 3 weeks in this cabin with this man and the fire and the wind and nothing else. She waited for the fear that had been her companion since the wagon ride to reassert itself. It didn't come. What came instead was something more like clarity, a settling of the terms, a sharpening of what mattered. "I'll start after breakfast," she said. He nodded, looked back at the window. She watched him for exactly 1 second longer than she should have, and then she looked at her coffee, and neither of them said anything else. The pantry inventory took most of the morning. She was thorough about it, which she suspected he hadn't expected. She counted everything, organized by type, calculated what they would need for 3 weeks against what they had, and wrote it all on a piece of paper in 2 columns, with the shortfall marked clearly on the right side. When she handed it to Mason at midday, he read it without speaking. His eyes moved down the page and back up. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll go to town tomorrow," he said. "Early." "I'll come," she said. "Road's rough. I've ridden rough roads. Not this one in November." She looked at him steadily. "Mason, I have been on this ranch for 5 weeks. I have not left it once. I would like to come to town." Something moved across his face. Not resistance exactly. More like recalibration. A man updating information he had apparently gotten wrong, the information being that she was content to stay put indefinitely. 6 o'clock, he said. "I'll be ready at 5:30. The corner of his mouth. There and gone. 5:30, he agreed. They left before first light. The ride to Red Willow Creek in November was exactly as rough as he had warned, and she had dismissed. And she sat straight on the wagon seat and held the rail and gave him absolutely nothing, no complaints. No adjustment of expression, no acknowledgement that her spine was registering every rut in the road with specific and personal resentment. Mason drove without comment. After the third particularly brutal section of road, she heard a sound from his direction that she was almost certain was a short, suppressed laugh. She turned to look at him. His face was perfectly neutral. "Don't," she said. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were thinking something." "I think a lot of things," he said. "Most of them I keep to myself." It was the longest personal statement he had made in 5 weeks, and it landed in the middle of the rough road, like a stone dropped in still water, and Lillian sat with the ripples of it all the way into town. Red Willow Creek in early November had a particular quality of suspended animation, everyone moving faster than usual, everyone's face slightly tight with the awareness of the coming cold, and everything that still needed doing before it arrived. Lillian noticed immediately, as they came down the main street, how people changed when they saw the wagon, the way they looked, the way some of them found sudden reasons to look at something in the opposite direction. Mason noticed too. She could tell by the set of his jaw, which had gone from its regular, careful neutrality to something harder. He drove to the mercantile and tied the horses and climbed down and stood on the boardwalk with his list of supplies and his expression that had closed itself like a shuttered window. And Lillian climbed and down on the other and straightened her coat and walked around the wagon and stood beside him. She did this deliberately. She stood close enough that the positioning was legible to anyone watching, which, from what she could see, was most of the street. Mason glanced at her. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the mercantile door. After a brief pause, he walked to it and held it open. She went through first. Inside, Martin Hutchins, Clara's husband, a heavy-set man with a permanent look of mild dissatisfaction, looked up from behind the counter. His expression did a complicated thing when he saw them together. Lillian watched him process the information and arrive at a kind of stiff cordiality that was the best he apparently had available. "Mr. Blackwood," he said. "Hutchins." Mason put his list on the counter. "I need everything on that." Hutchins picked up the list. His eyes moved over it. "Quite in order. Storm coming, so I hear." Hutchins glanced at Lillian. "Mrs. Blackwood. You're looking well." "Thank you," Lillian said pleasantly. "I am well." A beat of silence in which the unsaid things in the room were loud enough that all three of them could clearly hear them. "I'll get the boy to start pulling this," Hutchins said. He disappeared toward the back. Lillian moved along the counter, looking at the goods on display: thread, buttons, a small display of ribbon that seemed slightly incongruous given the general atmosphere of frontier practicality. She picked up a spool of black thread. She needed it. She had used the last of hers repairing a tear in Mason's work coat 3 days ago. From behind her, she heard the bell above the door, and then a voice she recognized. Well, there she is. She turned. 2 women from the church auxiliary. She knew their faces from before her marriage. Both of them were looking at her, with expressions that mixed avid curiosity with something she could only call theatrical pity. Lillian Carter, said the taller one, Margaret Drews. We heard you'd come to town with him. The word still landed the same way it always did, dropped from a height, designed to make a sound. How are you really, dear? Really, Lillian said. I'm fine. You can tell us the truth, said the second woman, leaning slightly forward. We're not going to repeat it. I know you will, Lillian said, because she had known both these women for 5 years, and she was past pretending otherwise. And what you'd repeat is this. I came to town with my husband to stock provisions before the storm. I'm going home with him afterward. And I'm fine. Genuinely and completely fine. Margaret Drew's mouth compressed into a thin line. You're very composed for a girl who was handed to a stranger against her will. Lillian felt something sharpen inside her chest. Not anger, she was too controlled for anger in public. Always had been, but something close to it. Something precise and useful. My uncle made a decision under financial duress, she said, keeping her voice level. I made a decision with open eyes. There's a difference, and the man you're all so concerned about has not given me a single reason to regret mine. She set the thread on the counter. Now if you'll excuse me, she said. I have a list to finish. Neither woman said anything else. Mason had been standing 12 feet away, near a display of rope and tack, and when she glanced at him, she found him watching her with the same expression she had first seen when she defended him to Clara Hutchins in the yard, that slight stillness, that fractional recalibration, the look of a man encountering something he doesn't have a category for. She turned back to the counter. A minute later, he came and stood beside her. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, close enough that his arm nearly touched hers, and looked at the display of goods as if he were interested in them, which she was fairly certain he was not. It was the most public thing he had done since they arrived, and she understood what it cost a man like him. She picked up a card of buttons and said, I need these too. Put it on the account, he said. That was all. But it was enough. They drove home in the late afternoon, with the wagon loaded and the sky pressing down low and purple-gray above the mountains, and the temperature dropping fast. Lillian sat with her coat pulled close and her hands in her lap and thought about all of it, the women in the store, the way Hutchins had looked at them, the way Mason had come and stood beside her without being asked, without comment, without any acknowledgement of the moment before or after it happened. Does it bother you? She asked. What they think of you? He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Used to, he said. And now? Now I think most people decide what they want to believe about a person before they know them, he said. And then they spend the rest of the time looking for evidence that they were right. Doesn't leave much room for the actual person. Lillian looked at his profile in the fading light. That's a very exact way to put it, she said. I've had years to think about it. And in all those years, she said carefully, You never tried to correct the impression? His jaw shifted. A small movement, barely visible. I tried. Early on, he kept his eyes on the road. Didn't take. After a while, you stop spending energy on things that don't take. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about a young man. She was doing the arithmetic in her head. He would have been in his early 20s when the rumors started. Maybe younger, deciding that the town of Red Willow Creek had made up its mind and he would simply stop arguing with it, withdrawing to his ranch, building his walls higher, becoming, through the sheer accumulated weight of other people's certainty, the thing they already believed him to be. What happened? She asked. Originally. What started the stories? He drove. She waited. My family died, he said. 3 words. The flattest 3 words she had ever heard, carrying a weight underneath them, that the flatness was doing everything it could to hold. She waited again. She had learned that Mason Blackwood, when he was going to say more, needed space to find his way to it, and interrupting that space was the surest way to close the door. Father, mother, and my younger sister, he said. Winter of 1873. I was 22. He paused. There was a storm, bad one. We'd been warned, but we had cattle loose on the North Ridge, and my father wanted to bring them in before it hit. I was supposed to go with him. He stopped again. The silence had a different quality, now heavier. More specific, the kind that belongs to a particular moment in a particular past. My mother needed wood brought in. She asked me to stay and help her first, and then catch up with my father. So I did. He looked at the road. By the time I got to the ridge, the storm had already come in full. I found them 2 days later. My father, my sister. They'd tried to shelter in a ravine. Lillian sat very still. My mother, he said. And here his voice did something she had not heard it do before, not break. Exactly. But show the effort of not breaking, the way a beam shows stress before it holds. She took sick from the cold. She lasted 3 weeks. Lillian looked at her hands in her lap. Mason, she said. People in town thought I'd changed, he said, pressing forward through the words, as if stopping would make them impossible to finish. I don't know what I'd been. I wasn't that person anymore. I didn't know how to. I stopped going places. Stopped talking to people. And when you do that long enough, people fill in the silence with whatever they need to put there. He stopped talking. The wagon moved through the dark and the cold. You were 22 years old, Lillian said. You lost everyone. And instead of being given time to grieve, you were turned into a ghost story. He said, nothing. That isn't. She stopped herself, because what she wanted to say was that it wasn't fair, and the word was so inadequate against what she was hearing that it felt like an insult. I'm not asking for anything, he said, and his voice was careful again, measured, back in its regular register. I'm not telling you for sympathy. I know, she said. I'm telling you because you asked. And because he paused. A long pause. You've been here 6 weeks, and you haven't tried to fill in the silence. I thought you deserved to know what's in it. Lillian turned to look at him full on. He was staring at the road. She looked at his profile, the sharp jaw, the lines around his eyes, the way he held the reins with hands that had clearly done this 10,000 times before. And she thought about a 22-year-old version of this face, standing on a mountain in a storm, finding what he had found, and living inside that moment for the next 10 years. She thought about the chest in the barn, the gloves with the worn fingertips, the folded cloth that still smelled of lavender, the small drawings, the journal in its oilcloth, the hairpin in the carved wooden box. The hairpin, she said quietly. Your mother made it. Yes, you kept it all these years. Yes. She looked back at the road ahead. And you gave it to me, she said. He didn't answer. But his hands shifted on the reins, just slightly. In the way hands shift when a person is aware they have revealed something they hadn't quite intended to reveal at this exact moment, and is deciding whether to retreat from it. He didn't retreat. He just drove. And Lillian sat beside him in the cold and felt something warm and terrifying move through the center of her chest. And she pressed her hands flat against her knees and breathed and did not say another word all the way home. She wore the hairpin every day. She had been doing this since her first week at the ranch. More out of practicality than sentiment, it held her hair back cleanly. It was well made and didn't slip. It was the right size for the work she was doing every day. But after the wagon ride home from town, the wearing of it became something different. She knew it, and she was honest enough with herself not to pretend otherwise. She just didn't know yet what to do with that knowledge. So she set it aside, in the same careful mental space where she had been storing all the other things she wasn't ready to address. There were other things to manage. The storm arrived on Thursday. It was not a polite storm. It came from the northwest with 3 days of advance wind followed by a drop in temperature so severe and fast that the water in the yard pump froze solid overnight. And then came the snow, not gentle, not picturesque, but driven horizontal and mean and relentless, the kind of snow that had weight and velocity and personal grievance. Mason had prepared for it with a kind of systematic thoroughness that she was coming to understand was the core of who he was. Everything that could be reinforced, he had reinforced. Everything that could be moved inside, he had moved. He had spent Tuesday and Wednesday working from before sunup to after dark, and she had worked alongside him, not in the way of someone helping, but in the way of someone who understood that there was a job that needed doing and was capable of doing half of it. They didn't talk much during those 2 days. There wasn't time. But she was aware of him constantly, where he was in the yard, what he was working on, the sounds he made when he was moving quickly versus when something needed more careful attention. She had developed, without planning to, a kind of peripheral knowledge of him, his rhythms, his moods which were subtle but legible once you knew what to look for, the way he moved when he was tired versus when he was working at full capacity, the way his voice changed, getting quieter, paradoxically, when something was wrong rather than getting louder. On Wednesday evening, with the first edge of the storm already audible in the roof, and the cattle settled in the south pasture with enough hay to last a week, they came inside at the same moment and stood in the kitchen with cold still on them and the warmth of the firemire working its way in. Mason looked at her hands. "Let me see," he said. She held them out. The blisters from the fence work had mostly healed, but the last 2 days had been rough on them, and the cold had cracked the skin at her knuckles. He took her hands in both of his. His palms were warm despite the cold outside, the hands of someone who ran hot, and he turned her hands over and looked at them with a focused, clinical attention that had nothing performed about it. He had never touched her before, not once in 6 weeks, not even accidentally. She was very still. He went to the shelf near the back door and came back with a small tin. "Calendula salve," he said, "for the cracks." He held it out to her. She took it. He turned toward the stove. She stood holding the tin for a moment, looking at his back, and the things she had put in, the careful mental space pushed against the edges of it. She opened the tin and dealt with her hands. She said nothing. He made dinner. That was the nature of the storm's arrival, not dramatic, not sudden, just the quiet tightening of two people's lives into a smaller space, with the wind outside, making everything feel more concentrated, more specific, more impossible to ignore. On the third day of the storm, when the snow was still coming and the road was buried and there was no question of going anywhere, Mason came inside at mid-morning with a different quality in his movement. Not hurried, but not his usual measured pace either. "East pasture fence is down," he said. 20 feet of it. Wind got under the posts. I didn't reset." She remembered. The east end post, still soft, he had said he'd reset it. The storm had arrived before he could. "The cattle?" she asked immediately. "Still in the south pasture. But if they find the breach before the storm breaks, they'll go through it," she finished. "Yes. When can you fix it?" He looked at the window. The snow against it was moving sideways. "Has to be now. Before it gets worse." She was already moving toward her coat. "Lillian," he said. "I'm coming. I know what it is," she said. "I'm coming." He watched her pull on her coat and wrap her scarf and find her heaviest gloves. He didn't argue further. They went out into it together. The cold was a physical force. It pushed against her chest when she breathed and found every gap in her clothing with immediate, intimate cruelty. She kept her head down and followed Mason's path. Through the snow he broke the way ahead of her, which she understood was deliberate, and she moved in the space he cleared and stayed close and kept moving. The east fence was exactly what he'd said. 20 feet down, posts and wire both. The posts hadn't frozen deep enough, and the wind had done the rest. Mason looked at it. She looked at it. "I'll hold the wire," she said. "You set the posts. The wire will cut through your gloves. Then I'll be careful." He looked at her for one moment, with the storms between them and the snow driving horizontal, and both of them already cold in a way that was going to get worse before it got better. "Don't let go of it when I'm hammering," he said. "The tension has to hold steady." "I understand tension," she said. Another moment. "All right," he said, and he turned to the posts. They worked for an hour and 20 minutes. Her hands went from cold to numb, to a kind of burning that she recognized from every piece of advice she'd ever heard about frostbite as something she should pay attention to. She paid attention to it, and she held the wire, and she did not let go once during any of the hammering. When the last post was set, and the wire was fastened, and Mason had checked the whole line twice, he turned to her and said nothing, and took her hands in his, and looked at them again, the way he had in the kitchen. Gloves still on. He pressed them between his palms and held them there and looked up at her face. "Can you feel them?" he asked. "Yes," she said. which was not entirely true but was true enough. He held her hands for another 30 seconds. She looked at the collar of his coat, which was the most neutral thing in her visual field. "We need to go in," he said. "Yes," she said. He let go. They went back to the cabin. Inside, he made her take the chair nearest the fire, and he brought the salve again. And this time he did not hand it to her. He sat in the other chair and took her gloves off himself, carefully, and looked at the state of her hands, and looked at her face with something that had gone past clinical and past careful, and was now just present. Just a man looking at a woman he had been trying very hard not to look at directly for 6 weeks. "They're all right," he said. "I know," she said. "You should have told me if they were getting bad. They weren't bad enough to stop. That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. But the fence needed to hold. He opened the tin and put salve on his fingers and took her right hand and worked it into the cracked skin carefully, covering every split, every raw edge. His hands were steady. So were hers. They were both, she thought, very good at steadiness by now. "Mason," she said. Tell me something else about her." He went still for a fraction of a second. "Your mother," she said. He resumed working the salve into her hand. She watched his face. She sang, he said, not well, but constantly. Everything she did, she sang to herself. Mending, cooking, working the forge. He paused. "My father used to say the animals calmed down when she came into the barn, because they'd gotten so used to the sound of her." Lillian looked at their hands. "What else?" she said. "She taught my sister to read before she was 4. Had this theory that the age people said was too young was just the age most adults stopped trying." He turned her hand over. "She was usually right about most things. She had that quality." "What quality?" "Of seeing things clearly," he said. Without the extra noise most people put around what they see. She just looked at something and told you what it was." Lillian was quiet. "You do that," he said. He said it to her hand, not to her face. She felt her breath stop for half a second. "You look at things and tell them what they are," he said, without the extra noise. She breathed again, slow and careful. "Is that good or bad?" she asked. He looked up at her then, full on. The gray eyes she had been learning to read for 6 weeks, all the way up. "I'm still deciding," he said. And before she could answer, before she could decide what the right answer even was, he released her hand, closed the tin, and stood up. "Rest them today," he said. "Both hands." He put his hat back on and went back out into the storm to check the south pasture fence. And Lillian sat in the chair by the fire with her hands in her lap, and the warmth coming back into them, slowly, and the feeling in the center of her chest that had no name she was ready to give it yet. And she thought about a woman who sang constantly and saw things clearly and taught her son, through the example of 30 years of living, that the most specific kindness a person can offer an ibis is simply to see them. She thought, "He's been waiting for that." She thought, "So have I." She pressed her palms together and held them there. Outside the storm went on, and inside the cabin in the fire's light, something that had been building for 6 weeks held its breath and waited. The storm broke on Saturday morning, not gently. It stopped the way it had started all at once, without transition, like a conversation cut short mid-sentence. Lillian woke to a silence so complete it had its own weight, and she lay still for a moment, just listening to the absence of wind, which after 4 days had become a sound she had stopped hearing the way you stop hearing a clock until it stops. She got up and dressed and went downstairs. Mason was already at the table with his coffee, and his face was doing the thing it did when he was thinking through something difficult, not tense exactly, but concentrated, the way a man looks when he is running numbers in his head, and the numbers are not coming out right. She poured her coffee and sat down across from him. "How bad?" she asked. He looked up. He had learned, somewhere in the last 7 weeks, that she did not need preamble, that she would rather have the direct version of a thing than the version wrapped in preparation. "Lost some cattle," he said. 8 head, maybe 10. "I need to ride the north ridge to know for certain." The fence held? The fence held. But the ravine on the north side, in a storm like that, animals panic. They move. He looked at his hands around the cup. "I need to go up today." "The road to town? Passable." "Barely," he paused. "I need to go to the ridge first. Then I'll know what else needs doing." She watched his face. "You're not telling me something." she said. His jaw shifted. The Harlan place is between here and the ridge, he said. They've got an older man, his daughter, and 2 grandchildren. Their structure is not. He stopped. I don't know how they came through it. Then we check on them, she said. On the way. Lillian, on the way, she said again. He looked at her for a moment. Be ready in 20 minutes, he said. She was ready in 15. The Harlan property was 40 minutes from the ranch on a clear day. That morning, with the snow up to the horses' chests in places and the trail erased entirely in others, it took an hour and 10. Mason navigated by memory and by the shape of the land under the snow, which he seemed to read the way other people read a page, not thinking about it, just knowing. She sat beside him on the wagon seat, and they didn't talk much, but the silence between them had changed again. It had been changing steadily since the day of the fence repair, since the moment in the kitchen chair when he had said, I'm still deciding, and looked at her directly for the first time with nothing held back. The silence now had a texture to it, a kind of presence. It was the silence of 2 people who had said enough that the unsaid things no longer felt dangerous, just unfinished. The Harlan roof had partially collapsed. They found out from 50 feet away, and Mason stopped the wagon, and Lillian was down before he was, moving through the snow toward the house at a pace that made no concessions to how deep it was. She heard him right behind her. The front door opened before they reached it. Nora Harlan, 26 years old, and holding herself together with both hands, stood in the doorway. Behind her, 2 children, a boy about 7 and a girl perhaps 5, peered around her at the strangers in their yard. Mr. Blackwood, Nora said. Her voice was even, but her eyes told a different story. I didn't expect. What's the structural situation? Mason said. Direct, no wasted time. Back half of the house, Nora said. The kitchen roof came in at 2 in the morning. We moved to the front room. She glanced at the children. We're all right, but the kitchen is. She pressed her lips together. And Father can't. She stopped again. He took ill 3 days before the storm. He's in the front room. Lillian was already inside. She didn't ask permission. She walked past Nora and into the front room where Daniel Harlan, 64 years old, and a man she had never met, lay on a cot near a fire that had burned down too low because no one had wanted to leave him to deal with the wood. She looked at him once, his coloring, his breathing, the way he was holding himself, and turned back to Nora. How long has he had the fever? 6 days. Has he been drinking water? When I can get him to. Lillian turned to Mason, who had come in behind her. The fire first. Then I need the medical kit from the wagon. Mason was already going back for wood. She didn't think about whether she had the authority to manage someone else's medical situation. She didn't think about whether she was overstepping or whether these people would resent her efficiency. She thought about Daniel Harlan's breathing and the color of his face and the 6-year-old girl who was watching her from the corner with enormous serious eyes. And she did what needed doing. Mason was back with wood in 4 minutes. He built the fire up without being asked, and then brought the medical kit from the wagon, without being asked for that, either. And Lillian registered this, peripherally the fact that he had anticipated what she would need before she said it and filed it in the accumulating evidence she was still, technically, not drawing conclusions from. They stayed at the Harlan place for 3 hours. In that time, Mason cleared what he could of the collapsed kitchen, assessed what would need to be rebuilt and in what order, and identified 3 other structural issues that would need attention before the next storm. Nora followed him around with a look on her face that Lillian recognized, the look of someone who has been in a crisis long enough that another person's competent presence is almost physically overwhelming. At one point, the 7-year-old boy, his name was James. She had learned, and he had the focused intensity child, who has decided that understanding what is happening is the only thing standing between him and complete terror came and stood next to Mason while he was examining a wall joint. Is it going to fall? James asked. Mason looked at the joint, then at James. Not today, he said. I'm going to make sure of it. James looked at him for a long moment with a merciless assessment of childhood. Okay, he said. And he handed Mason the end of the measuring tape he had been holding. Lillian saw it from across the room. She looked back down at Daniel Harlan before anyone could see her face. When they finally left, Nora Harlan stood on the porch and looked at Mason with an expression that had no performance in it whatsoever. "I've been telling people in town they're wrong about you for 2 years," she said. Mason went still. "My father worked with you on the Hendricks cattle drive in 1880, Nora said. "He came home and said you were the most reliable man he'd ever worked a long drive with. That you were the kind of man who made sure everyone else ate before he did." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what people decided you were, but I know what my father said." Mason said, "Your father is a good judge of character." "He is," Nora agreed. Then she looked at Lillian. "Both of you, thank you." They walked back to the wagon. Mason helped her up without being asked, naturally, easily, the way a man helps someone up when the step is high and the snow is deep, and it is the simple practical thing to do. His hand at her elbow for 3 seconds, steady and warm. Then he let go and came around to his side. They drove toward the North Ridge. "What she said," Lillian began. "Don't," he said. Not harshly, just quietly. "Mason, I'm not interested in whether people in town revise their opinion of me," he said. "I never was. I was interested in," he stopped, worked his jaw. "I cared once. When I was young and I thought it mattered. It doesn't. It doesn't matter that people see you correctly. It matters that the people close to me see me correctly," he said. "That's the only thing that has ever mattered." The sentence arrived and detonated quietly between them. Lillian looked at the road ahead. "The people close to me," she thought. "He is talking about me." She thought, "He knows he is talking about me." She thought, "We both know it, and neither of us is going to say so, and that is the most honest conversation we have had yet." "I see you," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "For what it's worth, I see you correctly." His hands shifted on the reins. "I know," he said. They found the cattle. 7 head lost to the ravine. Not 10, which Mason said was better than he had expected, and she believed him because she had learned to read the register of his voice well enough to know the difference between reassurance and truth. 3 more were scattered along the North Ridge, and it took 2 hours to bring them back, with Lillian working the left flank on a horse she had been learning to ride for the past 5 weeks and managing well enough that Mason said nothing critical, which she had come to understand was his version of high praise. It was nearly 4 o'clock when they turned back toward the ranch. The sky had that particular winter clarity that comes after a storm, hard and blue and painfully bright. Every edge sharp, the mountains visible in a way they usually weren't. Lillian rode slightly behind, and to Mason's right, and watched his back, and thought about everything that had happened in the past 8 hours and what it meant about who they were to each other now. They had been married for 7 weeks. She had been frightened for approximately the first 3 days of it. She tried to identify exactly when the fear had stopped, and she couldn't pin it to a single moment. It had been gradual, the way all real things are gradual, not a door opening but an ice thaw. Not an event but a process, accumulating through 100 small moments, until suddenly the accumulation was visible, and the fear was simply gone, and something else was in its place. Something she was not yet willing to name out loud. She was not a girl who moved fast with naming things. But she had always been, a girl who was honest with herself. They put the horses up together, moving through the familiar choreography of the barn with the ease of people who have done a thing enough times that the doing of it no longer requires conversation. She handled her own horse completely, untacking, brushing, water, feed, and she was aware of Mason watching her. Do it at one point, not in a checking way, but in the way a person watches something they find quietly satisfying. "You've gotten good with her," he said. "She's a good teacher," Lillian said. "She makes it very clear when I'm doing something wrong. Most good teachers do. Is that how your mother taught you things?" He was quiet for a moment, working a brush over his horse's flank in long, even strokes. "She taught mostly by example. She'd do a thing the right way and let you watch until you understood it. And then she'd step back and let you try." He paused. "She never made you feel stupid for not knowing something the first time. She just showed you again." "That's exactly the kind of teacher I want to be," Lillian said. She had not said this to him before. Not explicitly. "I was studying for the territorial teaching examination when..." She stopped, decided there was no reason to soft pedal it. When my uncle made the arrangement. Mason stopped brushing. She felt him looking at her. You want to be a teacher, he said. It was not a question. It was a man filing away information he had not had before, and visibly reassessing something against it. I wanted to be a teacher, she said. The timing became complicated. It's not impossible from here, he said carefully. The town Red Willow Creek doesn't have a school, she said. It has Mrs. Aldridge, who teaches children in her front room twice a week, and is 67 years old, and the only reason those children know how to read. Then the town needs a school, Mason said. She looked at him. He looked back at her with an expression that was entirely serious. You're saying that as if it's simple, she said. I'm saying it as if it's possible, he said. Which it is. He turned back to the horse. We're not going to solve it tonight, but it's possible. Lillian stood with the brush in her hand and looked at his back. She thought, he just adopted my dream as a problem to be solved. She thought, he did it in under 30 seconds without making a single thing about himself. She went back to her horse. Her hands were shaking, slightly, in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Not an uncomfortable quiet. Nothing between them was uncomfortable anymore, which was its own kind of astonishing given where they had started, but a thinking quiet. Both of them processing the day, she thought. Both of them sitting with things. She was clearing the dishes when he said, from the table, the chest in the barn. She went still. I know you found it, he said. His voice was even, not accusatory. She turned to look at him. I went looking for a lantern, she said. I shouldn't have opened it. I'm sorry, you didn't take anything. No. You didn't read the letters. No. He was quiet for a moment. I knew when you came back without the lantern. And then that evening, he paused. The way you looked at the hairpin. It changed. She set the dish down. She had not realized he'd noticed. She had been sure she'd covered it. You see people clearly, he said. But you're not invisible yourself. Not to someone who's been paying attention. The words settled in the room. Mason, she said. I put the chest in the barn because I couldn't get rid of it, and I couldn't keep it in the house, he said, speaking to the table. Keeping it inside meant living in it, and I had been living in it for 10 years, and it was he stopped. It was making me something I didn't want to be. What were you becoming? She asked quietly. He was quiet for a long moment. A man who had already decided how everything ended, he said, before it started. She moved from the counter and sat back down at the table. Not in her regular chair, in the chair closer to him. She sat and folded her hands on the table and looked at him directly. And now, she said. He met her eyes. The fire behind her threw warm light, and the cabin was silent except for the settling sounds old wood makes at night when the temperature drops. And Mason Blackwood looked at his wife of 7 weeks across a table they had shared for 49 mornings and said, with all the careful honesty of a man who has spent a decade choosing his words before he spoke them, now I'm not sure about the ending anymore. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lillian had ever heard. She breathed through it. She thought about saying a dozen things. She said good just that. One word, plain and definite, no performance in it. His chest moved on a slow breath. Good, he repeated quietly, as if testing the word. She stood up and went back to the dishes. He stayed at the table. After a moment, she heard him push his chair back and come to stand beside her at the basin. And he picked up a dish without being asked and dried it, the way he had done exactly 3 times before in their 7 weeks. And they worked through the rest of the dishes in silence. But the silence had changed again. It had weight and warmth and the particular density of something real, of something that had been earned through 7 weeks of cold mornings and broken fences and a wagon ride through its storms and the contents of a chest and a handwritten line at the bottom of a contract. No person in this arrangement will be compelled against their reasonable nature. She had thought, when she first read that line, that he was making a promise to her. She understood now that he had been making a promise to himself. A promise that this time he would not close everything off. That he would leave the door open, even if just by the width of one handwritten sentence, and see what came through it. What had come through it was her. The knock came 11 days later. Hard. Official. 3 raps with a knuckle that expected to be answered immediately. Mason was in the yard when it happened, and Lillian went to the door herself and opened it to find two men she didn't know, one in a suit that was expensive but not quite right for the territory, and one in a county sheriff's badge. She knew the sheriff by sight. Jim Calloway. She had seen him twice in Red Willow Creek, both times at the Mercantile. He was a fair man by reputation, careful, not given to drama. The man in the suit she had never seen. Mrs. Blackwood, Calloway said. He touched the brim of his hat. Is your husband available? He's in the yard, she said. What's this about? The man in the suit looked at her, the way men in suits look at women in doorways when they have to decide how the woman is not the relevant party. It's a matter concerning Mr. Blackwood's property, he said. A legal matter. I'm his wife, she said. Property matters are my matters too. The suited man opened his mouth. Lillian, she turned. Mason had come around the side of the cabin. He must have heard the knock, and he was standing behind her with his hat in his hand and his face in its closed, careful mode. He looked at Calloway, then at the suited man. Something moved across his expression that she had never seen there before. Recognition. And underneath recognition, something that looked like dread. Carver, he said. His voice was flat. Mr. Blackwood. The suited man, Carver, had the particular smile of someone who has prepared for this meeting and is satisfied with his preparation. It's been some time. Not long enough, Mason said. Calloway stepped forward slightly. Mason, I'm sorry about this. He came to me with the paperwork, and I need you to hear him out. What paperwork? Lillian said. Carver reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out toward Mason. Mason did not take it. Carver set it against the doorframe. Your father took a loan in the winter of 1872, he said, against this land, against 412 acres of Blackwood property, including all structures and water rights. He paused. He defaulted before he died. The debt passed to the estate. I represent the estate of the original creditor, who died last spring. His assets, including this debt, have been settled, and I am the settling party. The words landed in the cold air like stones into a frozen pond. Lillian looked at Mason. His face had not moved. You're claiming my land, he said. I'm claiming the debt against your land, Carver said. There's a distinction. You have 60 days to settle it. How much? Lillian said. Carver looked at her again, differently this time. He had recalibrated. She could see it. $1,100, he said. $1,100. She did not let anything show on her face. Neither did Mason. They were both, she thought, very good at steadiness. I'll need to review the document, Mason said. Of course, Carver said. Sheriff Calloway can provide a second copy, if needed. 60 days, Mr. Blackwood. He replaced his hat. I'll see myself out, he left. Calloway stayed. He looked at Mason with an expression of genuine apology. I verified the paperwork, Calloway said quietly. It's legitimate. I'm sorry, Mason. I didn't have a choice but to accompany him. I know you didn't, Mason said. Calloway left. The door closed. Mason stood in the cabin, with the document in his hand. He had picked it up from the doorframe, without her looked at it, and looked with an expression that was entirely controlled and was costing him everything that control required. Lillian stood 3 feet from him. Mason, she said. He looked up. Did you know about this? She asked. Not accusatory. She needed to understand what they were dealing with. My father mentioned a loan once, he said, before he died. I was 22 and he paused. I was in no condition to understand what he was telling me. I thought he had handled it. And then, everything. He set the document on the table. And then everything happened, and I didn't. He shook his head once. I should have gone through his papers. I should have found this. You were 22, and you had just lost your family, she said. That's not an excuse for being careless with the land. It's an explanation for being a human being in the worst year of your life, she said. He looked at her. $1,100, she said. What do we have? Not 1,100. How much land could you sell off? None that wouldn't compromise the operation. Timber rights? He went still. The North Ridge has timber. He stopped. I'd thought about it, but I didn't want to. How much? He calculated. She could see him doing it behind his eyes. Maybe 6. 700, he said. Maybe, depends on the buyer. That leaves 400 short, she said. Minimum. He said nothing. She thought. She thought fast and hard and without sentiment. The way you think when sentiment is a luxury the situation doesn't have room for. My uncle, she said. Mason looked at her sharply. He owes you, she said. Not the debt you settled that. But he owes you for what he asked me to do. And Gerald Carter, whatever else he is, pays his moral debts when they're made plain to him. She held Mason's gaze. Let me write to him. Lillian, I am not asking your family for your not asking, she said. I am, and it's not your decision. The silence stretched. You don't owe me anything, he said. His voice was low and very careful. The arrangement whatever you feel obligated to. Stop, she said. He stopped. I am not doing this because I feel obligated, she said. And she let him hear every word of it clearly, the way she let him hear everything she meant. I am doing this because this is my home, because that is my land out there, because the people who will lose something if that deed changes, hands are people I care about. She paused. And because you are my husband and I am your wife. And there is no version of this situation in which I stand to the side and watch. Mason Blackwood stood in the middle of his kitchen and looked at his 18-year-old wife who had arrived 7 weeks ago in a hired wagon, holding a book of poetry she never read. And something in his face did what she had never seen it do before. It broke open. Not in a dramatic way, not with tears or sounds or any of the performances of breaking. Just a fracture in the long-held careful stillness of it. A single moment of being entirely unguarded, entirely visible, entirely without the wall. She saw it. He let her see it. Then it was gone, and his face was itself again, but changed. A door that had been opened could not be entirely closed. And they both understood this. I'll ride the timber tomorrow, he said. See what we actually have. I'll write to my uncle tonight, she said. He nodded once. Then he sat down at the table and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a long moment. Lillian, he said. Thank you. She looked at him, at his hands on the table, at the document beside them that represented 10 years of accumulated grief dressed up as legal debt, all of it arriving now, all of it demanding to be faced. Don't thank me, she said, the same way she had said it to her uncle the morning she signed the contract. But it was different now. Everything was different now. Just ride the timber and tell me what we have. She went to find paper and ink, and Mason Blackwood sat at the kitchen table in the cabin he had built with his own hands on land his father had loved, and listened to his wife moving through the house with the particular purposeful sound of a woman's who had already decided the outcome, and felt something he had not felt in 10 years begin, carefully, painfully, and with extraordinary stubbornness, to take root. The letter to Gerald Carter went out the next morning. Lillian had written 3 drafts the night before, each one discarded because it was either too soft or too hard, too much pleading or too much accusation. The 4th version she wrote at midnight by the last of the lamp oil, and it said exactly what needed saying, not more, not less. She had described the situation plainly. She had named the amount. She had not apologized for asking. And she had not pretended the request was anything other than what it was. A debt being called in. Not the legal one Mason had settled. The other kind. The kind that doesn't have a document, but that both parties know exists. She sealed it before she could reconsider. Mason rode the north timber the following day and came back at dusk with the look of a man who has done his arithmetic and doesn't entirely like the answer but is working with it anyway. 720, he said, coming through the door and going directly to the basin to wash. That's what the timber's worth, at current prices. If I find a buyer willing to move fast. Carver's deadline is 60 days, she said. 48 now. She had the coffee waiting. He sat down without an ask, and she sat across from him, and they looked at each other the way they had learned to look at each other, directly, without theater, with the shared understanding that they were both going to say what they actually thought. Gerald might send something, she said. I don't know how much. I don't know if he has it. If he doesn't, then we find another way. She paused. What about the mining company? The one that came through 3 years ago. Mason's jaw tightened. Noble Mason. They wanted the water rights, he said. Not the timber, not the grazing land, the water. If they get the water rights, this operation is finished in 5 years, regardless of what else we hold on to. He looked at his hands. My father built this place around the creek. You compromise the water. You compromise everything. Then we don't sell to the mining company, she said. I understand. I'm asking what options we have. He was quiet for a moment. There's a man in Denver, cattleman named Forsyth. He's been trying to buy grazing rights on the east side for 2 years. I've turned him down twice. Grazing rights, not ownership? Lease. Renewable annually. He wants access for summer grazing. I'd keep everything else. How much? I never negotiated because I never intended to accept. What would you estimate? He thought about it. 300-400 for a 5-year lease. Maybe more if he wants exclusivity. She did the arithmetic quickly. 720 from timber, 300 to 400 from Forsyth. Whatever Gerald might contribute. It was close. Dangerously close. With nothing left over for the kind of margin that made a winter survivable. Right to Forsyth, she said. Mason looked at her. Today, she said. We don't have time to think about it twice. Those grazing acres are the best land I have, I know. If he damages them, put it in the lease terms, she said. You're not a man who signs documents without reading them. Write the terms that protect you and send the letter. He looked at her for a long moment. She held his gaze without moving. You're not afraid of any of this, he said. It came out like an observation, like a man noting a weather condition he hadn't expected. I'm afraid of losing the ranch, she said. I'm not afraid of the work of saving it. Those are different things. Something moved across his face. That fractional shift she had come to know as his version of being moved. All right, he said. I'll write to Forsyth. He wrote 2 letters that evening, one to Forsyth in Denver, one to a timber buyer in Colorado Springs, whose name he found in a 3-year-old trade notice he kept in a drawer with other practical documents. Lillian sat at the other end of the table and worked on a different problem she had been turning over for days without mentioning it to him. Mrs. Aldridge's front room. She had been thinking about it since the day Mason said, with such uncomplicated certainty, the town needs a school. She had dismissed it initially because 18-year-old women married 3 months did not start schools. Then she had stopped dismissing things simply because of the category she occupied. Because the ranch had cured her thoroughly of that habit, and she had started thinking about it seriously. What she knew, Red Willow Creek had 43 children of school age. She had counted, in her head, from memory of the families she knew. Mrs. Aldridge saw perhaps 12 of them. The others were needed at home, or lived too far from Aldridge's front room, or simply had parents who had stopped believing that the effort was worth what it returned. What she had. Time 3 mornings a week, when Mason didn't need her for ranch work. The ability to teach reading, arithmetic, basic history and geography. A genuine belief, inherited from a woman she had never met who had a small forge and a theory about what people deserved. That education was not a luxury. What she needed, a space. Books. Families willing to send their children. She wrote it all down on a piece of paper and then looked at it. She had just written the beginning of a plan. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She would tell Mason when the debt was handled, 1 crisis at a time. The reply from Forsyth came in 9 days. It came by fast courier, which told her that the Denver cattleman had been waiting for exactly this kind of opening, and had responded accordingly. Lillian brought the letter in from the postwriter and set it on the table and stood back and let Mason open it. Because it was his land and his negotiation, and she understood the difference between supporting a thing and taking it over. He read it. His face gave nothing away. He handed it to her. Forsyth was offering $580 for a 7-year exclusive summer grazing lease on the East Acres, with a clause about land condition that was reasonable and a renewal option that favored the lessee slightly more than it should. The renewal clause, she said. Yes, Mason agreed. Counter it. Ask for mutual agreement on renewal, not his option alone. And add a land assessment at the end of each season so you have documentation of the condition. He looked at her. You read contract language. I read everything, she said. Counter it today. He wants this deal. He sent a fast courier. He'll negotiate. Mason wrote the counter that afternoon. Forsyth accepted within the week. $580, with Mason's modified terms intact. The timber buyer in Colorado Springs sent his own representative out to walk the North Ridge on a Thursday. He was a compact, businesslike man named Ellery who walked the timber with Mason and said very little, and then sat down at the kitchen table and wrote a number on a piece of paper and slid it across. $740. Lillian, who happened to be bringing coffee at that moment, set the cups down and went back to the counter and very carefully did not show anything on her face. Mason said $780. Ellery said $760. And I'll send 2 crews before the end of the month. $760, Mason said. And you're not on my land after the 1st of March. Done. Lillian poured her own coffee and stood at the counter and calculated. $760 from timber, $580 from Forsyth, $1,340. The debt was $1,100. That left $240, not a fortune, not a comfortable margin, but enough. Enough to get through the rest of winter. Enough to breathe. She was still standing at the counter when Ellery left, and Mason came back inside and looked at her. "We're all right," she said. "We're all right," he confirmed. She exhaled. It was not a dramatic exhalation. It was the kind that happens when a person has been holding something in their chest for weeks, and finally, carefully lets it go. Mason stood across the kitchen from her and watched her do it, and she didn't hide it from him. "Gerald's letter," he said. "Whatever comes. Doesn't change anything now," she said. "We don't need it." He nodded. "Keep it anyway," he said. "Whatever he sends. Keep it." She looked at him. "It's not about the money," he said. "It's about whether," he paused. "It matters what he chooses to do, regardless of whether we need it." She understood. He was not talking about the money. He was talking about whether the man who had handed Lillian to a stranger for the price of a debt was capable of recognizing, when it cost him something, what he owed her. "Yes," she said. "All right." Gerald's letter arrived 4 days later. She recognized the handwriting on the outside immediately, and she took it from the postwriter and stood with it in her hand for a moment before she opened it. Inside 2 things, a letter and a bank draft. The draft was for $300. She read the letter standing in the cold. Gerald Carter had written 7 drafts of his own. She suspected, because the thing read like a man who had been fighting himself on every sentence. He described the source of the money. He had sold a piece of land he'd held separately from the business, a small parcel he'd been intending to leave to Margaret. He said that Margaret had insisted. He said that they had both understood, reading Lillian's letter, that what had been done was not something a bank draft could fully address, but that this was what they had, and they were sending it. At the bottom, in different ink, like the handwritten line at the bottom of a marriage contract, Margaret Carter had added 3 words, "Fight like hell." Lillian stood in the yard in December cold and looked at her aunt's handwriting and pressed her lips together and breathed through her nose for 10 seconds, until she was certain she was not going to cry. Then she folded the letter. She went inside. She put the bank draft on the table and the letter in the pocket of her coat, next to the folded paper with her school plan on it. Mason came in from the barn at the end of the afternoon and looked at the draft and then at her face. "300, she said. He looked at the number, then at her. "Your aunt's idea," he said. Not a question. He had met Margaret Carter exactly once, at a meeting that lasted 11 minutes, and had apparently learned everything he needed to know about her. "How did you know?" "Because your uncle would have sent less and called it enough," he said. "And because you're looking at that table, the way you look at something that surprised you into feeling something you weren't ready for." She looked at him. He was right. He was entirely right. And the fact that the fact that this man she had arrived to in fear, had learned to read her face more accurately than people who had known her for years, was its own kind of astonishing. "We'll pay Carver the full amount Monday," she said. "I'll ride to town, I'm coming." He didn't argue. They rode to town on Monday. Calloway was there when they arrived at the small land office where Carver had established himself for the duration of his business in Red Willow Creek. The sheriff had come, he said, simply to see the matter properly closed, which Lillian translated as him wanting to witness the look on Carver's face. She was glad he was there. Carver received them in the land office with the specific smoothness of a man who knows he has lost this round and is managing his response to it. He looked at the bank draft Mason placed on the desk and looked at the total and looked at Mason. "Full settlement," Mason said. "So I see." Carver's smile did not reach anything above his mouth. "You've been resourceful." "Write the receipt," Mason said. Carver wrote the receipt. He signed the discharge document. He slid it across the desk. Mason picked it up and read every word of it with the same attention Lillian gave to every document she encountered. And she stood beside him and read it over his arm. And when they had both read it, he folded it and put it in his coat. "Pleasure doing business," Carver said. Mason looked at him for exactly 3 seconds. "No," he said, "it wasn't." He turned and walked out. Lillian looked at Carver for 1 additional second, which was enough to make her point without any words required. And then she turned and followed her husband. Outside, Calloway was waiting. He shook Mason's hand without ceremony and said, "Glad that's done," and that was the whole of it. Because Calloway was a man who understood that some victories were best honored briefly. They walked back to the wagon. Halfway down the main street, Mason stopped. She stopped beside him. He was looking at the empty lot on the east side of the street, between the land office and the hardware store. She had noticed it before a flat, cleared space that had once held a building that burned down several years ago. She knew this because the scar of the old foundation was still visible at the edges. "What do you know about building permits in this territory?" "Oh," he said. She looked at the lot. She looked at him. "Less than you," she said carefully. "Why a room?" he said. 30 by 20. Solid walls. Good windows for light. A stove in the center. He looked at the lot, then at her. "How many children did you say?" Her breath stopped. "Mason 43, he said. "That's what you said. I've been thinking about the dimensions. 30 by 20 would hold 25 comfortably. 30 if you had the right arrangement of tables." She stood on the main street of Red Willow Creek into December and looked at her husband. "You've been thinking about dimensions," she said, "since you said the town needed a school." He turned to face her fully. "I said it was possible. I don't say things I don't mean. Building a schoolhouse is not." She stopped. Started again. "It would cost. I know what it would cost. I've been building structures for 12 years. He looked at the lot again. "I'd need help. Harlan, maybe. He owes me a season of fence work, and he'd rather pay it in labor." "Mason." She said his name and stopped. Because there were too many things in her chest, and she was having difficulty choosing which one to say first. He looked at her. "You were going to figure this out on your own," he said. "I know you were. I saw you writing something at the table 2 weeks ago, and you folded it when I came close. You were going to present me with a finished plan." She had nothing to say to that, because it was exactly true. "We don't have to do everything alone," he said. His voice had gone quiet. The particular quiet that meant he was saying something that had traveled a long distance, a guidance to out. "That's what I'm trying to." He stopped, looked away toward the mountains, then back. "I've been doing everything alone for 10 years because I thought that was the only way nothing could go wrong. But things went wrong anyway, and you have been here for 3 months. And things still go wrong, but he paused. They go better." She stood in the cold and looked at his face and let herself, for the first time without any reservation or caution or self-protective distance, feel the full weight of what had been growing in her chest since a wildflower in a tin cup of water. "They go better," she said. "Yes. For me too," she said. He held her gaze. She held his. And right there on the main street of Red Willow Creek, with Calloway somewhere behind them, and the hardware store proprietor visible through his window, and half the town potentially watching, Mason Blackwood reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically. Not with any flourish. Just took it. His large calloused hand around hers. Steady and warm. The same warmth she had felt when he held her hands after the fence repair. But different now, because there was no clinical pretense. No practical reason. Nothing to call it except exactly what it was. She closed her fingers around his. They stood like that for 5 seconds. Then he said, "We should get home before the road ices." And she said, "Yes." And they walked back to the wagon with their hands still together. And neither of them said anything about it, and neither of them let go until he needed both hands to drive. The ride home was quiet, but it was the fullest quiet she had ever sat inside. 3 weeks later, December deepening into its coldest stretch, a second knock came to the door of the Blackwood Ranch. This one was soft, uncertain. Lillian answered it. Nora Harlan stood on the porch, with both children behind her, James, with his serious 7-year-old eyes, and his sister Rose, with her fist wrapped in the hem of Nora's coat. Nora was holding something. A covered dish. The gesture of a woman who has been raised to never arrive empty-handed. "I heard," Nora said without preamble, "about the debt. About how you handled it." "Word travels," Lillian said. "In this territory it travels like wildfire, and it's twice as warm." Nora held out the dish. "It's not much. But we wanted." She glanced at the children. "Father is better. He's up and walking. He says to tell Mr. Blackwood that he owes him more than one fence." Lillian took the dish. "Come in," she said. "Oh, we don't want to impose, Nora." "Come in." They came in. Mason was at the table, with a set of rough sketches spread in front of him. She had seen them accumulating over the past week. Dimensions and notes, and load calculations in his careful engineer's hand. He looked up when they entered, and his expression did the thing it always did when children appeared unexpectedly. In his field of vision, a slight recalibration, a gentling around the eyes that he probably wasn't aware of. James walked directly to the table and looked at the sketches with the focused attention he apparently brought to everything. "What are those?" James asked. "Plans," Mason said. "For what?" "A building." James studied them. "Why does it need so many windows?" "So people inside can see." "What people?" Mason looked at Lillian. She looked back at him. "Children," Mason said. "It's going to be a school." James looked at the sketches again, then at Mason, with the expression of a boy updating information rapidly. "Are you building it?" he asked. "Working on it. Can I help?" Mason looked at this 7-year-old with his serious eyes and his measuring tape he had handed over in the kitchen 3 weeks ago, and said, with complete seriousness, "When the foundation goes in, I'll need someone to hold the line." James nodded once. "Okay," he said. Nora was looking at Mason the way people look at something that keeps surprising them past the point where they expected to stop being surprised. She turned to Lillian with an expression that asked 20 questions at once. And Lillian answered all of them with a single look that said, I know. They stayed for 2 hours. By the end of the first hour, Rose had fallen asleep on the rug near the fire with Mason's barn cat, a gray animal of extreme opinions who tolerated exactly 3 people curled beside her without objection. And Nora was at the table with Lillian, working through the list of families with school-age children, and who among them might be persuaded, and by what argument. And Mason was in the corner, with James explaining load-bearing principles with the patience of a man who had learned from a woman who showed things rather than just said them. After Nora and the children left, Mason came and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table where Tillis Licken was still working on the list. 31, she said without looking up. Families who might send children if the school is free, and the hours are designed around working mornings. He looked at the list. That's more than 25, he said. I know, you'll need to reconsider the dimensions. 35 by 22, he said, as if he had already done this calculation. She looked up at him. Were you already planning for more? She asked. I was planning for the number it needed to be, he said, not the number that was convenient. She held his gaze for a moment and felt that warmth move through her chest again. The one without a name she was ready to say out loud. The one that had been growing since October and that she had stopped pretending she wasn't aware of. Mason, she said. Yes, the chest in the barn, she paused. Would you bring it in? He was very still. Not to live in it, she said, but not to keep it in the barn either. There's a shelf in the back room. It would fit. He looked at her for a long moment. She waited, the way she had learned to wait, without filling the silence, without hurrying what needed its own time. All right, he said. He went to the barn. He came back carrying the chest with both hands, carefully, the way a man carries something he has not carried in a long time. He set it on the shelf, in the back room where she had cleared a space for it, and he stood back and looked at it, sitting there inside the house. In the light visible, he was quiet for a long time. Lillian stood in the doorway of the back room and gave him that time. Finally he said, She would have liked you. It was the most complete thing he had ever said to her. She felt it move through her all the way down. I think I would have liked her too, she said. He turned to look at her. His face was entirely open. No wall, no careful neutral, no measured distance. Just the face of a man standing in a room with a woman he trusted, holding something fragile and not needing to put it down. "Lillian," he said. Yes, he crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. He raised one hand and touched the silver hairpin at the back of her head, one brief touch. Fingertips against silver, and then against her hair, the lightest possible contact, and looked at her with everything he had been not saying for 3 months, written plainly on his face. She didn't move, she breathed. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said. He stopped, looked at his hand. "Put it down. I am not a man who says things easily. You know that, I know that. But I don't want to." He stopped again. "I have spent 10 years not saying things to avoid the risk of them. And I am not going to do that anymore. Not with you." She waited. "I am grateful this happened," he said. He meant the marriage. He meant all of it, the contract, and the wagon, and the hairpin, and the fence, and the storm, and the debt, and the chest, and 3 months of mornings, with coffee and the weight of her hand in his on the main street. "I am grateful in a way I don't have the right words for. But I want you to know it." She looked at his face, at the lines around his eyes, and the sharp jaw, and the particular steadiness of a man who has decided to say a true thing and is saying it. "Mason," she said. "Yes, I know." He held her gaze. "And I am grateful too," she said, "for exactly the same things. In exactly the same way that doesn't have words." Something left his face. Not went wrong, went right. The last of the wall, the last held breath, the last of the 10-year-old distance between this man and anything that could mean something to him. He reached out and took her hand again. She closed her fingers around his. They stood in the doorway of the back room, with the chest on the shelf behind him, and the fire going in the front room, and the cold outside, doing what December cold does. And it was not a dramatic moment. There was no thunder, no revelation, nothing cinematic about two people standing in a doorway holding hands. But it was the most real thing Lillian Carter Blackwood had experienced in her 18 years of living. And she thought, this is what choosing looks like. Not the choice made under pressure in October. Not the signature on the contract. Not even the decision to stay through the hard weather and the harder revelations. This choice, right now, the one that didn't have anything forcing it, the one that was made simply because it was what she wanted, and what he wanted, and what they had built together, out of the materials life had handed them. The choice made freely. She thought, my mother would have told me to fight like hell. She thought, this is the fight, and I have won it. Outside, the December wind moved around the corners of the cabin and found nothing to get through, because Mason Blackwood had built everything solid and sealed every gap, and inside the fire held, and the chest sat on its shelf, in the light where it belonged, and two people stood in a doorway and held on. The schoolhouse went up in February. Not all at once. Nothing real happens all at once, but in stages. The way things get built when the people building them have other work to do and a hard winter still presses down from above. Mason started with the foundation on a Thursday morning when the ground was just soft enough to work, and by Friday afternoon Daniel Harlan had ridden over on the horse he was still not supposed to be riding, according to every piece of medical advice Lillian had given him. And James was beside him, with his serious face and his small hands ready to hold whatever needed holding. Lillian brought coffee out at mid-morning and stood in the cold and watched the three of them work, the older man moving carefully, but with the precision of someone who had been building things his whole life. The child holding the line with the focused gravity of someone who understood that the line mattered, and Mason in the center of it all, directing and demonstrating and correcting with the patience of a man who had learned from a woman who showed things rather than just said them. She went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with her list of families and her notes about curriculum and the territorial teaching examination booklet she had written away for in January, and she studied until the cold came through the walls enough to make her fingers stiff. She passed the examination on the first attempt. The certificate arrived on a Tuesday in late January, a formal document on heavy paper with the territorial seal at the top, and her name printed clearly. Lillian Ann Blackwood, certified teacher, Colorado Territory. She had been sitting at the kitchen table when the postwriter came, and she had signed for it and gone back inside and opened it and sat with it in her hands for a long time before Mason came in from the barn. He saw her face before he saw what she was holding. "What is it?" he said, already moving toward her. She held out the certificate. He took it. Read it again. When he looked up, his face had done the thing it did, that fracture in the careful stillness. The door opened wide. "Lillian," he said. "I know," she said. He set the certificate down on the table with enormous care, as if it were something that could be damaged by handling. And then he crossed to the stove and stood with his back to her, for a moment doing nothing, just standing, and she understood that he was managing something, and she gave him the time to manage it. When he turned around, his face was itself again, but changed. "Your mother," he said. "She would—" "I know," Lillian said, before he could finish, because she did know, and because some sentences don't need their endings to land completely. He came and sat across from her. "Tell me what you need for the school," he said. "Everything. The full list." She pulled the other paper from her pocket, the one she had written 3 months ago, and folded before he could see it, and smoothed it on the table between them. He read it without interrupting. "Slates," he said when he finished. 20 to start. More as enrollment grows. McGuffey readers, 2 sets if we can manage it. The younger children and the older ones can't share the same material. The stove. I was planning a central mount, but a corner installation gives you more floor space. She looked at him. "You've already been thinking about interior layout." "I've been thinking about it since January," he said, without any apology for having done so privately. She looked at her list, and then at him, and thought about the version of herself who had arrived at this ranch in October with 2 bags and a book of poetry and a careful plan to endure whatever came. She thought about how wrong that version of herself had been about almost everything that mattered. "Mason," she said. He looked up. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The dimensions and the layout and the—" She stopped. "For saying it was possible." "It was always possible," he said. "Someone just had to stop waiting for permission." She held his gaze. He held hers. And then he said, "Corner mount on the stove." And she said, "Agreed," and they went back to the list. The schoolhouse was framed by the 3rd week of February and enclosed by the 1st week of March. Word spread through the territory, the way Nora Harlan had promised, like wildfire. Twice as warm. Lillian had written to every family she could identify within reasonable distance, and she had asked Calloway to spread the word among families he knew through his work, and she had talked to Mrs. Aldridge, who had received the news of a proper schoolhouse with the expression of a woman setting down a very heavy object she had been carrying for years. "I have been doing this in my front room for 11 years, Mrs. Aldridge said. She was sitting at Lillian's kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and her eyes were bright, with something that was not quite tears, but was closely related. 11 years and 17 different children at most, in that room at one time, and the smell of my husband's pipe tobacco in everything." She paused. "I would like to come and teach with you, if you'll have me. 1 morning a week. The older children. History." "I would be grateful," Lillian said. "Good." Mrs. Aldridge set her cup down with finality. "Then it's settled." The school opened on a Monday, in the 2nd week of March, with 22 children and 2 teachers, and a stove in the corner that Mason had installed over 2 days, with the help of Daniel Harlan, who had by now fully recovered and who considered himself personally responsible for the structural integrity of the building in a way he expressed by coming by every few days to look at the walls. Lillian stood at the front of the room on that first morning and looked at 22 faces, looking back at her, some uncertain, some eager, some performing a careful neutrality that she recognized from her own reflection, and felt something settle in her chest that she did not have a name for, but that felt like arrival. Not the arrival in October at a ranch she hadn't chosen. The arrival at something she had built herself, with her own hands and her own mind, and the particular stubbornness that had apparently been there since the beginning, waiting for the right conditions. James Harlan was in the front row. He had a slate and a piece of chalk and an expression of total readiness. She thought, "He is going to be extraordinary." She said, "Good morning." 22 voices said it back. She began. 3 days after the school opened, Clara Hutchins came to the classroom during the lunch hour. Lillian heard the door and turned from the board, where she had been writing the afternoon's arithmetic problems, and found Clara standing in the doorway with her hands folded in front of her and an expression Lillian had never seen on her face before. Not the polished cordiality of the mercantile. Not the theatrical concern of that first visit to the ranch. Something plainer than either of those. Something it looked like it cost her to show. "I wanted to see it," Clara said. "Come in," Lillian said. Clara came in. She walked slowly around the room, looking at the slates. The readers stacked on the shelf. Mason had built along the east wall. The map of the territory Lillian had drawn herself and pinned above the board. She looked at the stove in the corner and the good windows that let in the afternoon light. "He built this," Clara said. Not a question, he did. With Daniel Harlan and 3 other men from neighboring properties. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Mason Blackwood built a schoolhouse for your children." "For the town's children," Lillian said. Clara turned to look at her. "I owe you an apology," Clara said. It came out clean and direct, which surprised Lillian. She had expected more navigation, more hedging. "I came to your ranch in November because I thought I understood your situation. I didn't. I thought I understood him." She paused. "I didn't understand that either." "No," Lillian agreed. Clara stopped. "We were all so certain. And I think—" She looked at the window. "I think we were certain because it was easier than being curious. Being certain doesn't ask anything of you. Being curious is more work." Lillian looked at this woman who had come to her ranch with pity dressed as concern and had left without managing to shake her certainty, and who was standing in a schoolroom now with something genuinely different on her face. "It is more work," Lillian said. "But it's worth it." Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She left. Lillian turned back to the board. She wrote the first arithmetic problem and thought about certainty and curiosity and the specific cost of each. And she thought about a 22-year-old man who had stopped arguing with a town that had made up its mind. And she thought about what that decision had cost him in the years between then and October. And she thought about what it had taken to walk back through the door of a life that included other people. She was still thinking about it when she heard the door again. She turned. Mason. He was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hand. Always his hat in his hand. Always, without fail. And he looked at the room and at the board and at her standing in front of it with chalk in her fingers. "The east fence is done," he said. "Already?" Harlan helped. She looked at him. He was looking at the board. At her name written at the top corner, Mrs. Blackwood, teacher, which she had written on the first morning as a statement of fact, and had left there because it remained accurate. "Mason," she said. "What are you doing here in the middle of the day?" He looked at her. "I wanted to see it," he said. The same words Clara had used, but different. Everything he said was different because of what was underneath it, the accumulated weight of everything she knew about him now. She set the chalk down. "Come in then," she said. He came in. He walked around the room the way Clara had, but slower, and with different attention. He ran his hand along the edge of the shelf he had built, checking the level the way a builder checks things, by feel more than by sight. He looked at the stove installation. He looked at the windows. He looked at James Harlan's slate, which the boy had left on his desk with the morning's lessons still chalked on it. And he stood over it for a moment, reading what was there. "He's fast," Mason said. "He's exceptional," Lillian said. "I've been giving him additional work to keep him from finishing before the others, and spending the rest of the lesson time staring at the ceiling." Mason almost smiled. "What does he do when he finishes?" "He checks everyone else's work, without being asked. He doesn't correct them out loud, he just looks. And if someone's stuck, he positions himself where they can see his slate and works the problem again slowly." Mason was quiet. "He's 7 years old," Lillian said. "He's already decided that other people understanding the thing matters as much as him understanding it." Mason looked at the slate for another moment. Then at her. "That's a rare quality." "Yes," she said. "It is." He held her gaze, she held his, and in the space between them, in this room that smelled of chalk and new wood and the particular clean cold of a March morning in the mountains, something that had been growing since October reached its full height. She could feel it. She thought he could too, from the way he was looking at her, not the careful neutral, Not the measured distance, but with everything present, everything forward, nothing held back. "I have something for you," he said. She went still. He reached into his coat. He brought out a small wooden box, smaller than the first one. Same smooth sanding, same careful workmanship. No carved flower on the lid this time. Just the grain of the wood and the clean line of the join. He held it out to her. She took it. She lifted the lid. Inside, on a fold of soft cloth, the same cloth from the chest, she recognized it. The cloth that had held the smell of lavender lay a small carved necklace. A pendant on a fine chain, the pendant shaped like an open book, no larger than her thumbnail. Carved from the same dark wood as the box. Sanded smooth. Finished with the kind of patience that meant someone had spent a long time on a small thing because the small thing mattered. She looked up at him. His face was open, entirely open. "I made it," he said. "From the timber off the North Ridge. The first section they cut." He paused. "I asked Ellery's crew to set one piece aside before they started." She looked at the pendant in its cloth and thought about him, asking a timber crew to set one piece aside. Carrying it home. Working it in the evenings, when she thought he was doing account books. Shaping it into this, into an open book, into the most specific possible symbol of the thing she had spent 3 months building in the middle of a life she hadn't planned. "Mason," she said. "The first box was my mother's," he said. He was speaking carefully, the way he spoke, when he had thought something through, completely before he said it. The first gift was hers. Her work, her belief, her idea of what a woman deserved. He paused. "This one is mine, my work, my idea of what you deserve." He looked at the pendant, "Which is everything. But this is what I could make." She closed the box. She pressed it against her chest, with both hands the way she had pressed the first box on her first day. And she stood in her classroom on a March afternoon, with chalk on her fingers and her name on the board, and looked at me, who had been afraid of her leaving since before she arrived. And she said the thing she had been carrying in her chest since a wildflower in a tin cup of water that neither of them ever spoke about out loud. "I love you," she said. The words were plain and direct and not dressed up in anything, because Lillian Carter Blackwood did not dress things up. Mason looked at her. She watched it move through him, the thing those words did. The way they traveled through a man who had spent 10 years building walls specifically designed to keep that sentence from ever reaching him again, and now stood in a schoolhouse and now the walls down and nowhere to put the impact except directly in the center of himself. "Lillian," he said. "I know it's I love you," he said. Not after a long pause. Not after managing himself or finding the composed version. Just immediately. Straight back, the truth returned in the same plain voice she had used, with the same absence of performance and the same complete sincerity. She breathed. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her and raised his hand, and she thought he was going to touch the hairpin again. That brief touch she had felt in the doorway of the back room. But instead, he cupped her face in both hands the way you hold something you have decided to stop being afraid of losing, and looked at her directly with everything showing. "I have been afraid," he said, "every single day since October, that I would wake up, and you would have decided you'd made a mistake." "I don't make mistakes twice," she said. "I know that now," he said. "It took me a while." "You're not slow," she said. "You're careful." "Both," he said. "I'm both." She put her hands over his hands against her face. "Mason," she said, "I'm not going anywhere." He closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, he was entirely himself, not the ghost story the town had made him. Not the damaged man who had turned his grief into distance. Not the dangerous cowboy who had frightened people for a decade. Just a man standing in a room his hands had built, holding the face of a woman who had seen him clearly from the beginning and had chosen, every single day, to stay. He kissed her. Once. Careful and certain and unhurried. The way he did everything that mattered to him. She kissed him back. The rest of March moved differently after that. Not because the work changed, the ranch still needed what the ranch needed. The school still needed what the school needed. The territory's March weather still had opinions it expressed loudly and without warning. But the texture of the days was different. The mornings were different. The way they moved through the same spaces had changed in the way spaces change when two people stop navigating around each other and simply exist in the same place. She still wore the hairpin every day. She wore the necklace, too, under her collar on teaching days, because it was her private thing, hers and his, not for the classroom or the street. But she touched it through the cloth. Sometimes when she was standing at the board, watching 22 children work, and she thought about the North Ridge timber and the man who had asked a crew to set one piece aside before they started cutting. The things a person does when they are learning, slowly and against every previous instinct, to stay. Gerald Carter came to visit in April. He came alone. Margaret had wanted to come, he said, but someone needed to mind the store, which they had managed to keep through the winter with the money saved from selling the separate parcel. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon on a horse that had seen better years, and he tied it at the fence and stood looking at the cabin for a moment before he knocked. Mason answered the door. The two men looked at each other for 3 seconds. Lillian, coming from the kitchen, saw Gerald Carter, looking at the man he had handed his niece to for the price of a debt, and saw whatever it was he had expected to find in Mason's face not being what he found, and saw him recalibrate in the way that people recalibrate when they discover they have been wrong about a thing they were very certain of. Carter, Mason said. Mr. Blackwood, Gerald said. He looked at Lillian. She looks. He stopped. Something moved across his face. You look well, Lillian. I am well, she said. Yes, he said. I can see that. She stepped back from the door. Come in. Gerald came in. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and looked around the cabin at the shelf of books, at the chest visible through the back room door, on its shelf in the light, at the certificate pinned to the wall above the table, at the wooden box sitting on the sideboard where Lillian kept it. He looked at the certificate for a long time. Teacher, he said. Yes, she said. He looked at Mason. She always wanted to teach. Since she was small. Her mother was the same way. He paused. Her mother could make anyone understand anything. She had that quality. Lillian was very still. Gerald looked at his coffee. I know I don't have the right to ask how things are. I know what I did, and I know what it cost, and I know the $300 doesn't. He stopped. But I want to know anyway. How things are. She looked at this man who was not a villain, and was not a hero, and was simply a person who had made an impossible choice under impossible pressure, and had spent 6 months living in the specific guilt of it. Things are good, she said. Genuinely, Gerald looked at Mason. Mason met his gaze. She's built something here, Mason said. Both things. The school, and he paused. Here, she's built something here. Gerald looked at his niece. She met his eyes. I know, he said. I can see it. They had dinner together. The three of them. At the kitchen table, where Lillian had signed a contract 6 months ago and started learning what her life was going to be. Gerald ate and asked careful questions about the school and the ranch and the cattle operation. And Mason answered them in the same direct way he answered everything. And Lillian sat between them and felt the particular complicated feeling of watching two people navigate the aftermath of a decision that had changed everyone's life. After dinner, Gerald stood to go. At the door, he shook Mason's hand. Mason shook it back. Firmly, once. The handshake of two men who had not chosen each other and were not going to pretend they had, and who understood what the terms of the current peace actually were. Then Gerald turned to Lillian. He hugged her. He was not a man who hugged easily. She could feel the effort of it. The reaching past years of managed distance, and she stood in it and let him have the 30 seconds and then stepped back. Your mother, he said, and his voice was rough. Your mother would be, he stopped. She would be so proud. She would be so proud she would have talked about you for a year. Lillian pressed her lips together. I know, she said. I know she would. He left. She stood on the porch and watched him ride down the track and disappear into the tree line. And Mason came and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. And she leaned into him slightly, and they stood like that until the sound of the horse was gone. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, she said. Are you actually all right? Or are you managing? She thought about it honestly. Both, she said. But more the first one. He tightened his arm around her shoulders. They went inside. By summer, people in Red Willow Creek had mostly stopped telling the story of Mason Blackwood, the dangerous cowboy. They had replaced it with a different story, which was closer to true, the story of a quiet man who built a schoolhouse, who helped his neighbors without announcement, who had married a woman from town under difficult circumstances, and had apparently given her exactly the life she was meant to have. The story got things wrong in the details, the way stories always do. It left out the wildflower in the tin cup, and the hands held across a kitchen table after a blizzard, and the conversation in a barn doorway about a woman who sang constantly and saw things clearly. It left out the handwritten line at the bottom of a contract, and the wooden chest on its shelf in the back room, and the way Mason's face had changed over the course of one winter, from a closed door into something that had light coming through it. But the broad shape of it was right. And Lillian, when she heard people telling it, didn't correct the details. She just wore the hairpin and the necklace, and taught 31 children on 3 mornings a week, and came home to a ranch that smelled of wood smoke and cattle and the particular clean air of the mountains in every season, and sat across the kitchen table from a man who saw her as clearly as she saw him. James Harlan finished his readers in May and started on Mason's copy of the agricultural manual, which he found on the shelf and read with the same total attention he brought to everything. Lillian discovered this and wrote away to the territorial library for more advanced texts. When they arrived, she gave them to James and watched his face do what faces do when they receive exactly what they need at the exact right moment. She thought, this is why. She thought about that often. About why. About the specific chain of events that had led from a piece of paper on a kitchen table to a classroom in Red Willow Creek, and what it meant that the chain had links she would not have chosen if she had been given the choice. She stopped arriving at a definitive answer. She thought the reason she stopped was not because the answer was too complicated, but because it wasn't complicated at all, and the simplicity of it was the part that kept stopping her. The answer was Mason. The answer was trust built over hard weather and a chest on a shelf and hands that learned how to let go of the wall they had been holding for 10 years. The answer was a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to simply see him, and a girl who had arrived in fear and had done exactly that, because seeing clearly was the thing she had always been best at. And sometimes the thing you are best at is the thing that saves you both. On an evening in late June, Lillian came home from the school to find Mason sitting on the porch steps in the last of the long summer light. He was doing nothing, not working, not reading, not managing something, just sitting, which was unusual enough that she slowed her horse and looked at him for a moment before she got down. She tied the horse and came and sat beside him on the steps. They watched the last of the light move across the mountains. "Good day?" he asked. "Very good," she said. James started the history text. He came to me at the end of the lesson to argue that the textbook's account of the cattle drives was incomplete because it didn't include the perspective of the men who actually worked them. Mason was quiet for a moment. "He's right," he said. "I know," she said. "I told him to write his own account, from what his father has told him." Mason looked at her. In the evening light, his face was exactly what it had become: open, present, entirely without the wall. "He's going to do something with himself," Mason said. "He's already doing something with himself," she said. "That's the point." They sat in the late light. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. He stayed. That was the thing about Mason Blackwood. She had come to understand. He stayed. It was not a dramatic quality. It did not announce itself. But it was the truest thing about him, the way he had stayed on this land, through 10 years of grief and isolation, and a town that had made him into a story. The way he had stayed open through one handwritten line at the bottom of a contract, even when everything in him had wanted to close completely. The way he stayed now. "Mason," she said. I'm glad it was you." He turned to look at her. She held his gaze, the way she had always held his gaze, without looking away, without softening it or dressing it up. "I'm glad it was you," she said again. "Of everyone, it could have been. I'm glad my uncle was desperate enough and scared enough and human enough to make the worst decision of his life and land me on your doorstep in October with 2 bags and a book I couldn't read." Mason held her gaze for a long moment. "Lillian," he said. "Yes, I'm glad too." He said it with the same plainness she used for everything that mattered. Every day, every single day, she leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The mountains held the last of the light, the way the mountains always held the light in this country, longer than anywhere else, as if they were reluctant to let it go, as if they understood that what was visible in it was worth keeping visible as long as possible. They sat until the dark came. Then they went inside. The fire was already laid. Mason had done it before she got home, he always did. The same way he always made sure the coffee was ready in the mornings, and the wood was stacked before a storm, and every gap in every wall was sealed against the cold. The same care. The same daily, unannounced choosing of the person beside him, over the easier solitude of not needing anyone. She lit the fire. He put the coffee on. They moved through the cabin in the familiar choreography of two people who have learned each other's rhythms completely, who have stopped navigating around each other and simply exist in the same space, who have made of a forced beginning something so thoroughly chosen that the beginning is barely the point anymore. The fire caught. The coffee was ready. They sat at the table where everything had started, the same table. The same two chairs, the same cabin built by one man's hands on land his father had loved, and outside the Colorado mountains, held the dark the way they held everything, solidly, without apology, with the particular permanence of things that have been here longer than the stories told about them. This was not a marriage that began with love. It began with a piece of paper and a debt and a girl with 2 bags and a book she couldn't read. It began with fear on one side and 10 years of grief on the other, and a town full of certain people who had decided what they knew without asking what was true. It began with a small wooden box and a handmade silver hairpin and 3 words spoken across a kitchen table before a stranger had even taken off her coat. She believed every woman deserved something beautiful, even during difficult times. It began with that, and it became everything else: the fences and the storm and the chest on its shelf and the schoolhouse and 31 children and a certificate on the wall and a necklace shaped like an open book, worn close to the skin, private and permanent. It became 2 people who chose each other not once, under pressure, in October, but every single morning after that, freely, deliberately, with open eyes. Because sometimes the life you didn't choose is the one that shows you who you are. And sometimes the person everyone warned you about is the one who was waiting, all along, for someone willing to look past the story and find the man. Mason Blackwood had been that man the whole time. Lillian Carter had been the one willing to see it. And that, in the end, was the only love story that had ever mattered, not the one that arrives ready-made and certain, but the one that is built, day by day, out of trust and work, and the quiet daily courage of 2 people who choose every morning to stay.